Hello, and welcome to History on Blast, episode 24. Anything you can do, I can do better. On today's episode, we're going to be putting the confusing mix of legend and fact that is the American Revolution on blast, specifically in the case of Sybil Ludington. But first, this month in history. On April 9th, in 1865, the American Civil War effectively came to an end with General Robert E. Lee's surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. This came on the heels of the loss of the Confederate capital only days before, and General Lee's last-ditch effort to bring his army back together to keep the war going. And before we move on to today's topic of Sybil Ludington, I've got a message for you all from our friends of the show over at Tone Deaf.
Hi, I'm Kay, a musical theater nerd. Are you someone with a deep passion for musical theater? Is your significant other, best friend, or some other special someone in your life someone who knows nothing about it? Does it drive you nuts? If so, join us every Wednesday for Tone Deaf, a theater nerd's guide for their musically challenged spouse, where I subject my husband, Warren,
that's me,
to musicals in front of a captive listening audience.
I'm only slightly scared.
Tune in every Wednesday for Tone Deaf.
Okay, so let's talk about Sybil Ludington. First off, I put this directly after Paul Revere very much on purpose, because basically it's the same story but transposed into upstate New York, in Putnam County specifically, and instead of marching on Lexington and Concord, we're talking about the town of Danbury. But basically, same story. The differences come in two major places. One of them, obviously, we are talking about a girl named Sybil. She was actually 16 at the time of her ride. The other part is, and this sort of, I'm not really sure what to do with this information, but, well, let's see where we go from here. Basically, everybody accepts Paul Revere's ride based on the poem that I talked about last time, even though we know that the poem is wildly historically inaccurate compared to the truth. But it's a very well-ingrained popular image that I already ranted about last episode, and I'm trying really hard not to rant about this time. But Sybil Ludington gets the kind of the opposite treatment. And I think to fully understand why, I'm going to back up and start from the beginning. So, let's talk a little bit about who Sybil Ludington was. She was born in 1761 in what was known as Fredericksburg, it's a section of the town of Kent in New York, and it's now known as Ludingtonville, which, okay, that says something right there, just make a note of that. Her father, Colonel Henry Ludington, was a militia officer. Specifically, he commanded the 7th Regiment of the Dutchess County Militia, which was one of those, volunteer regiments of militiamen who basically won the war. He also later became an aide to General Washington, which means that I think if I'm working out all of my timelines and all of that bullshit correctly, means he probably knew Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette, which, awesome. Next piece of information, we don't really have a definitive spelling of Sybil. The modern spelling that you see a lot of places is Sybil, and that's how you're going to see Sybil Ludington spelled if you look her up for whatever reason, but her tombstone actually says Sibbell, and in places where she signed her own name, she actually spelled it Sebal, which is an absolutely wild spelling of Sybil that I have never seen before. In fact, the Sybil, modern spelling of Sybil, is never used to refer to her in any official document ever during her lifetime. Awesome. On April 25th in 1777, she was a 16-year-old girl living at home with her father and 11 brothers and sisters. She was the oldest. And a 2,000-man British force commanded by General Tryon, which is in fact spelled Try-on, if you feel like looking him up for whatever reason, they landed in Fairfield, Connecticut, and they were planning on marching north into Danbury, where there were stores of supplies for the Continental Army. There was food, there was clothes, there was all kinds of things. The only thing that wasn't there was the medicine, because they were actually storing that in New Milford, Connecticut. But anyway, so there are soldiers marching across the countryside, planning on doing what, British soldiers do in colonized territory, which is, mark the things that belong to loyalists and burn that which does not. They found stores of rum and got very drunk, because that's also what they do. And at about this point, messengers had gone out to start organizing the militias, not really thinking they could defend Danbury, because, oh man, they definitely can't. Danbury is on fire, my dudes. But instead, to attack the British. This was less a, message going out of, arm the men, we must protect the town, and much more, we're gonna go fight back. I actually almost would say that, the militia in Boston were the defenders and the militia down in New York were the Avengers, if you get the reference. But anyway, so Colonel Ludington got the message that the British were out there and that he needed to go on the attack, and the messenger arrived at his home at 9 at night, and he started to organize, but he's like, well, crap. Everybody is everywhere. I'm going to need someone to go out and get the rest of my soldiers. And this messenger is basically dead on his feet. So I need somebody else to go out. So he looks around and goes, Sybil, you're 16. You're the oldest of my kids and therefore the responsible one. Go warn the countryside. And she's like, cool, I got this, Dad. And rides off. And this is where we go sailing blissfully off out of confirmed history and kind of into legend. But we may have already done that. This is one of those really wild cases where the historians in the local area say, this absolutely happened. And more general, broader historians are like, well... So, there are some who say that Sybil volunteered for this ride. There are some who say that her father asked her to go, and that he chose the route. If you read some of the accounts, they're like, and she had to fight outlaws with a stick. I'm not even kidding. I read those exact words earlier. Literally said she had to fight highwaymen and outlaws with a stick. But more likely is that she went from house to house to spread this message, because that's how the militia system worked. There are definitely some parts of the story that are made up. Like, it took 100 years for anyone to write this down. It wasn't recorded at any point during her lifetime. It actually wasn't until her grandson was talking to a historian that any of this got written down. And by that point, you start getting details like, well, the ride was 40 miles long, and that's twice as long as Paul Revere rode, which is maybe true? Unclear? And the horse's name was Star, probably not true. No one knows for certain. But whether or not it's true, this is one of those legends that speaks to... It speaks to the heart of what the revolution and what America is supposed to be about. It's not just Paul Revere, the crusty white boy who got arrested and didn't actually do his mission, who goes down in legend. You have the 16-year-old girl doing this for her father, and she's just as much an American hero, even if she doesn't get the same praise. I mean, unless you're in Connecticut, upstate New York, you're not going to hear about Sybil Ludington as part of your general education, when I'm pretty sure everybody knows who Paul Revere was. I don't think that's just a Massachusetts thing. We just got him crammed down our throats. So, after the war, Sybil Ludington settled down. She married a man named Edmund Ogden. They had a son named Henry, and it was actually her grandson who provided her story to historians, and that's why we have it to this day. As far as pop culture goes, there actually is some representation of her. She was brought up in there's a PBS cartoon called Liberty's Kids that was very big in the early 2000s, and I highly recommend it if you have kids who might be into history, because it's a very well-balanced telling of the Revolution. But episode 21 was about Sybil Ludington. There was also, in 1993, there was a chamber opera written about her, which is pretty hardcore. I don't think Paul Revere has an opera. Just saying. One more thing about the controversy before I totally leave you for this week. And this is one of those things that I found absolutely just fascinating in sort of a but really kind of way. So the Daughters of the American Revolution, or the DAR, is a membership service organization where membership is based on a linear familial descendants from a soldier or other person who aided in the cause of independence. And here's the thing. In 1996, the National Daughters of the American Revolution organization said that they didn't have enough evidence, that the evidence was not strong enough to support their criteria to call Sybil Ludington a war heroine. They actually removed a book about her from the bookstore at their headquarters. Now, the local DAR chapter near her hometown said, "Excuse me, there is absolutely documentation, and we're going to continue honoring her, so, fuck you, I guess." And that hasn't been resolved. That is still an ongoing argument. At least I can't find a resolution to it, and I kind of think that's weirdly hilarious, that they can't resolve this when we have so many other things that are just considered a canonical part of the Revolutionary War mythos that are so ridiculous. And yet, like, we have stories of people during the Battle of New York who literally, like, when they were literally fighting in the streets in Manhattan, literally somebody, according to the stories, picked up a cannon and ran. Like, they stole the British cannons, is a part of the story, and apparently, according to the stories, one dude picked up a cannon and ran with it. And everyone goes, yes, of course. Even though, I mean, sure, it's not a shipboard British long gun, but it's still a cannon. They're very heavy. But apparently, a grown-ass man running away with a cannon is easier to believe than a teenage girl riding a horse. So I guess, in conclusion, Sybil Ludington is more than just a legend, more than just a hero of the Revolution, whether or not you believe the stories. She is very much a beacon of what the Revolution was and also what it can be. Because you can't just read a piece of history for what it was. Not when you're talking about something that is a mythological foundation of an entire population. And in a very real way, the events of the American Revolution are the American mythology. We, as the descendants of colonists and immigrants, we don't have that kind of same history and mythology that a lot of other more long-established civilizations have. But we have this one war, and we have what came before it and what came out of it, and that is our mythology. And I think that regardless of whether or not the story of a 16-year-old girl riding a horse named Star for 40 miles for hours late at night through enemy countryside and fighting outlaws off with a stick, whether or not this is true, it should be remembered and taught, because otherwise all of the heroes of our mythology are the same. And having one that speaks to the teenage girl and says, she could do this, so can you, is very much for the best for our future. Well, things got weirdly deep there at the end, but that's going to just about do it for us for this week. As always, if you like what you're hearing, make sure to rate and review on iTunes. That is and always will be the best way of ensuring that other people find the show. If you've got friends who you think might like the show, be sure to tell them to listen. We've got a Facebook group now. It is a private, secret group, so if you don't want everyone to know that you're, a history nerd making memes ragging on Thomas Edison in your spare time, no one has to know. As always, I'd like to thank Defy Them All for the use of their song Keeper of Histories for the intro and outro of our program. If you've got any questions, comments, feedback, anything at all, even if you just want to talk, you can find me on Twitter at HistoryOnBlast, or you can find me at Gmail, historyonblast@gmail.com. And as always, thank you for listening.